The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, my name is Sanjay Baliga. I am a senior manager in the Environmental Health and Safety Division of SEMI in San Jose, California in the United States. Welcome to the SEMI webcast on responding to the current global swine flu pandemic, suggestions for SEMI members and industry partners. Of course, SEMI members are concerned about the possible impacts of the current global influenza pandemic, also called the swine flu or H1N1 flu. They're concerned because it represents a threat to business continuity and preparedness. To address these concerns, SEMI is hosting 2 free webcasts, which will summarize the current swine flu pandemic and suggest approaches to respond to it. Of course, we have 2 webcasts because of the global nature of our membership. The first webcast is taking place right now, Wednesday, May 6, 2009. We have a second webcast which is scheduled for Monday, May 11, 2009. That's for the Western Hemisphere. For the Eastern Hemisphere, this will correspond with Tuesday, May 12th. You can join the second webcast if you feel free. Our sponsors for today's webcast include SEMI, that's the Semiconductor Equipment and Materials International, the PV Group, SACIA, which is the Semiconductor Environmental Safety and Health Association, and TURF, which is the Technology Emergency Response Forum, an affiliate of SACIA. First, a small disclaimer. The presentation material today is intended for guidance only, and while the information is provided in utmost good faith and has been based upon the best information currently available, it is to be relied on at the user's own risk. You should probably consult legal counsel to determine the applicable law or situation for your own company. The agenda today, and we hope to schedule about 2 hours for the webcast. The agenda includes the 5-minute for introduction. This will be followed up with an introduction to influenza by Elizabeth Aton. She expects to take about 20 minutes. This will be followed up by a presentation from Dr. Don Lassiter, who will spend 20 minutes talking about the threat of pandemic influenza. Mr. Aaron Zudi of SEMI will focus on pandemic planning and looking at rational approaches for these. He'll take about 15 minutes. Then Raylene Wong of Applied Materials will take up to 20 minutes to talk about an industry perspective on pandemic planning. We've allocated as much as 40 minutes for the question and answer session. Regarding the question and answer session, participants may forward their questions to the speakers using the webcast interface. The webcast interface, there are 2 large arrow buttons. You can push those buttons, and this will open up the webcast control panel. You'll notice that in the control panel, there is a section on questions. Please go to the second box, type in your question, and hit the send or submit button. Your questions will be forwarded to the presenters. We ask you to use proper grammar and spelling, and of course, keep your questions simple. So let's move forward, and let's have Elizabeth Aton let us know about the influenza, the pathology and epidemia of influenza. Liz, are you with us today?
Thank you, Sanjay. It's my hope that with this presentation, I will be able to give the attendees enough background information to understand the perspectives of the World Health Organization, CDC, and local public health actions that are taking place now with respect to the influenza that is circulating now.
Okay,
so,
thanks.
Sanjay,
Liz, can I take a moment and actually introduce you?
Surely.
Okay, thank you. So, as you'll see on the webcast interface, this is the bio for Liz. Liz is a specialist in environmental health and safety and has practiced in the field for more than 25 years. She has worked in the aerospace and semiconductor industries for an urban tertiary care hospital and a large healthcare organization, and has done research in applied health topics at a large medical school. She now consults for industry and governmental clients and does pro bono service for community emergency planning and operations. Aton holds a BS degree in chemistry and an MS degree in industrial hygiene and has published in peer-reviewed journals. Liz, please take over the webcast.
Thank you, Sanjay. May I have the first slide?
Yes, just one moment while I bring it up. There you go.
Thank you, Aaron. You can move, Sanjay, you can move to the second slide. This slide describes for the attendees why the 2009 H1N1 influenza matters. The first information that was available to the World Health and Centers for Disease Control in the United States indicated that 2009 H1N1 influenza could be a significant concern in terms of world health. The reasons for this include, first of all, the fact that this influenza included a genetic reassortment that includes both human and swine influenza genes, meaning that the genetic reassortment that had occurred in this influenza could have implications for human pathology. Second, the population across the world was essentially unprotected from an immunity standpoint to this influenza. There is as yet no vaccine available for this influenza, and further human-to-human transmission had been documented. In the early days of the recognition of the outbreak, the mortality ratio was staggeringly high for an influenza, and while the denominator for the mortality rate has not been determined and probably won't for some time, the individual figures that were coming out
Liz, are you still with us? Looks like we're having some technical difficulties. Liz? Okay, this is an unfortunate problem with any webcast. We're going to try to get Liz Aton back on the phone, back on the webcast here. In the meantime, is it possible, Don, would you like to move your presentation forward?
Oh, that'll be fine. Just keep in mind that Liz kind of had the pre-part of that thing, so it's unfortunate she can do that. But
it looks like she's back with us. Liz, I noticed that...
Hello, I'm sorry that the line dropped. I live in a very small town in the Midwest U.S., and that happens occasionally. Let me continue with the second slide there. Monitoring the additional mortality ratio showed that it could be as high as 6%, and further noting that the mortality figures included otherwise young and healthy individuals rather than the frail population that is often seen in an influenza outbreak. Further, the influenza was being found across the globe, including in other countries than just North American countries. And the last point to make being that the first line of antiviral drugs, including amantadine, was ineffective against this influenza, and calling thus then for the pulling out of the second line drugs. So the first line response not working, second line required. Next slide. Now, to understand how influenza operates, which is important to understanding the response by public health agencies, I would want you to think of influenza, if you have not had the background, as a burglar, someone who would break into your house. So in that model, the influenza, the burglar, uses a key to get into your house. Once in the house, tears everything apart and destroys everything, and finally uses a club it brought along to smash out the doors and get out. Now, if I could have the next slide, I can convert that into the viral mechanism understanding. In general, a virus will act in terms of an animal, plant, or human pathology by using a mechanism based on its genetic code to enter the host cell. Once it's in the host cell, it will then divert the entire contents of that cell, including genetic materials found within the cytoplasm of the cell, and use that to make more copies of itself. Once the copies have been made, then the virus, depending on which one it is, will slink out of the host cell, will find a way to break out of the host cell, and then each of those viruses formed that way can then invade another host cell. So you have a cycle of new viruses being made, infecting additional cells, those cells being destroyed, and more virus cells being created. And when we get a little farther to the drugs that are being used, you'll see why I wanted you to be aware of that method. Next slide. I wouldn't expect that you would have to worry about the details and the specifics in this slide. I have used this, however, so that you get a physical representation of how a virus would infect the cell. So up at the top, you see the virion, which is a name for a single virus particle, breaking into the cell, going into the cell and turning the cell mechanism into making new virus copies. And finally, at the bottom, you see the virus then, having been formed that way, breaking out of the cell, becoming another virion that then can go on to infect other cells. So that's a representation of the viral process. Continue, please. In understanding a virus, you should be aware of how basically crude a virus is in terms of a microbiological pathogen. A virus is generally a code of either DNA or RNA with some kind of proteinaceous material covering it. Very simple, no cytoplasm like a cell, just protein material, genetic material. In terms of influenza, the surface chemistry of that protein coat is of significant importance. So let's go on. Slide. Okay, in terms of influenza, there are two surface proteins that are important. Now, I will pronounce them, and the exact pronunciation is not critical for you to know, but when we get to the questions or something online, if anyone has additional questions or wants details, I'm happy to provide them. The two surface proteins important in influenza are hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. These are the proteins that when you see the influenzas described as an H something, N something, these are the structures, the types of structures that that virus nomenclature is describing. The hemagglutinin, or the H piece, gets the virus into the host cell. It's like the key breaking into the cell back in our burglar model. The neuraminidase is the key to getting the virus out of the host cell. So both of those features are important in generating new viruses through destruction of cells. Next slide. I should have mentioned earlier in the previous slide that what you're looking at is a photomicrograph of the new H1N1 flu. If you look closely, you may be able to see an aura surrounding the little circular materials. These would be the protein code with the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. As I mentioned earlier, the virus types for influenza are identified by their hemagglutinin, H, and neuraminidase structure, leading to this current influenza outbreak being described as an H1N1 flu, meaning that in studying it, the scientists have determined that the hemagglutinin key in this case is type 1, neuraminidase is type 1. And flus are additionally identified by the year, the location, and whether they're type A, B, or C. Let's go to the next slide. And while there are different kinds of influenzas and different organisms susceptible, suffice it to say that for our purposes today, recognize that most human influenzas are influenza A. Now, further identifying the influenza virus, you should note that influenza is an RNA virus with packets of genetic material inside. One of the points I would like you to be aware of is that because it is an RNA virus, the reassortment or the recombining of the influenza genetic material, being that it's an RNA virus, means that about every 10,000 divisions recombining, there will be a mutation present. Further, there is the potential for, in a particular host that may be carrying two influenza viruses, those two influenzas can substantially reassort their genes between the two materials. This is why the influenza that's circulating now has swine genes and human genes. Next slide. Again, as with my earlier diagram, the point is not to understand all of the details with the structural model of the influenza, but rather to get a visual representation of inside the genetic material, outside the neuraminidase. If you can see the green with the red top, little key to get out of the cell, and the yellow spiky points being representing the hemagglutinin to get it into the cell. Next slide. This slide is far too busy to go through in terms of a lecture, but I have included it because it gives a visual representation of how influenza changes periodically. As I've mentioned, because it's an RNA virus, every 10,000 or so replications, there'll be a mutation, an error introduced into the code. So influenza changes from time to time. The right-hand side graphic, however, indicates when you have had a genetic reassortment from birds to pigs to humans, humans to pigs to birds, that sort of mechanism. And the genetic reassortment is why we have the SN1, with all of those individual characteristics. Next slide. Slide. Okay, sorry. I think everyone is aware of this, but I did want to include a slide on the symptoms of influenza. I think that many people think that any kind of muscle ache or feeling achy is what they call the flu, but true influenza is a significant disease with any or all of the symptoms identified on the slide. And as you note on the connection material, in terms of the complications, it can be truly deadly by worsening chronic medical conditions or leading to further infection. Next slide. I have been talking about influenza for a number of years, giving presentations, and I included this slide because in all of those presentations, I have mentioned this point and made this point very firmly, that because of the genetic reassortment and the way influenzas operate, there will be another pandemic similar to the ones that have occurred in this century, or in the 20th century. Next slide. And because of the recognition of the H5N1 bird flu that occurred in Hong Kong, or that broke into the population in Hong Kong in 1997, the World Health Organization and CDC began to take a very proactive posture in terms of identifying and recognizing the potential for a novel influenza to hit the population. They did that through surveillance, having sources ready to create vaccines as needed, creating in the United States stockpiles of drugs, and the World Health as well maintains those, and recognition of potentially radical changes to healthcare delivery. This could include influenza patients being treated in something like a convention center, reserving hospitals for surgical patients or cardiac patients, quarantine arrangements, and as we're discussing today, business and commerce arrangement changes. New slide. These are the points that I'd like to make sure that as you go back to your planners, your companies, and working with your public health, that they understand with 2009 H1N1. First of all, it is a deadly, not a trivial illness. There have been deaths from this. While the mortality rate is still in flux, it has been a killer disease. And again, we have no vaccine. However, on the positive side, we do know that basic hygiene practices, hand washing, surface cleaning, will lower the infectious rates, including cough etiquette, people learning to cough into a tissue and then washing their hands. Thinking about sick leave policies in terms of motivation for employees to come in to work if they are sick. Additionally, recognition that the two drugs, Tamiflu and Relenza, have been effective against this virus. And if you'll note on the slide, I have put that they are both neuraminidase inhibitors. That is, they act by essentially prohibiting the neuraminidase function on the influenza virus, prohibiting that from getting out of the cell, so you don't have additional virions created. And finally, public health cooperation, which I know each of you in your respective areas, geographic areas, are working with. Next slide. I do want to finish with some special notes, because what I'm hearing in my part of the world is a lot of talk of people that they think that this has been an unreasonable response, and they think that basically viral threats just go away. I want to make the point from my second slide, again, why we think this is an important virus and why the response that has been made to date has been done. I also want to mention, because I've heard it talked about too, that SARS, the disease that broke into the population some years ago, is not over. We may see that virus again and have to respond to it. Bird flu, H5N1, is not over. In other words, our risk of the H5N1 virus breaking back into the population is still as substantial today as it was 3 weeks ago before this H1N1 broke into the population. And furthermore, however what happens with the 2009 H1N1 works out, when we determine the true mortality rate, when we determine the infection rate, when we determine the effective therapy, what has been done right now, considering what we know about the virus, none of this activity has been wasted or was not needed. So that's a point when you're talking with your management and your employees and your community members to identify that based on what has been known with this virus, this influenza, everything that has been done to date, with the possible exception of some overreaction quarantines, but basically everything else is appropriate for the hazard knowledge and the amount of knowledge at the time. Now, if I could have the next slide, I think that's the final slide. Good picture. For the individuals talking about using a tissue for coughing and sneezing, this is a lovely picture that shows visually how many mucus, saliva, cellular particles are released when an individual coughs without a tissue. It's more than a little frightening. And closing with the last slide of more information, those in the United States can use the cdc.gov, FEMA.gov, and the state and local public health. And also across the world, individuals can go to the WHO website for the latest updates and suggestions about strategies. That finishes what I was to say. I have also posted my contact information on the presentation. I encourage questions during this conference call, as well as questions or email that may develop downstream of this call. I'm very happy to help or share ideas or fine points of influenza biology. Anything that might be helpful, feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for enunciating a great introduction to influenza. Can I ask you to sit there, hold on, because we're going to have you back for the question and answer session, and I'm sure many people will be asking very specific questions.
I'll do my best to answer them.
Great. Thank you very much. Next on our agenda is Dr. Don Lassiter, who will be presenting about 20-minute introduction regarding the threat of influenza pandemic. Don, are you with us today?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Don, give me a moment. Let me just bring up your speaker biography. Here we go. Dr. Don Lassiter is a public health scientist with special interest and experience in occupational and environmental health and epidemiology. He has been professionally active in these fields for over 30 years. Lassiter has managed several industry-wide systems of worker injury and illness surveillance for the U.S. semiconductor, electronics, healthcare, and chemical industries, involving more than 250,000 workers annually. He has developed corporate-wide work injury and illness computerized surveillance systems for a variety of corporations in the electronics and healthcare industries. Lassiter holds a BS degree in microbiology, MS degree, and PhD degrees in environmental health from the University of Oklahoma. Don, thank you for joining us. And you have about 20 minutes, but feel free to take longer. Let me bring up your slides. There you go.
Good morning, good afternoon to the participants in this conference call. I'm going to speak on the threat of pandemic influenza and particularly on the corporate response to this disease, both from a recently past historical standpoint as well as present-day considerations. The next slide, please. I believe that Liz Aton has presented a very useful and practically beneficial presentation on pandemic influenza considerations, and I'm just going to use this next slide to kind of tie her presentation into mine. You can see at the top there we have talked about avian influenza, H5N1, which Liz has indicated in her last couple of slides is still a very important consideration, and perhaps more important as we go on and people begin to consider their planning efforts with respect to this potentially very catastrophic potential pandemic and use the H1N1 episode to perhaps gain some momentum in analyzing their present pandemic plans. And of course, we're looking now at swine flu H1N1, which I have indicated is highly contagious. Probably it's mildly contagious at this point, although it has spread, of course, from human to human. And as I mentioned to the group in the state of Oklahoma, where I reside, we had our first case yesterday of the H1N1 influenza. Just a couple of terms that are useful in understanding. Endemic is a disease that's prevalent in a particular geographic region, either during parts of the year or perhaps year-round. Epidemic would be an outbreak of contagious disease that spreads rapidly, and of course that's what we're seeing now with the H1N1 virus. And of course a pandemic is a worldwide or wide geographic area that affects a large proportion of the population. Liz did a beautiful job of defining antigenic drift and shift, and I won't get into that anymore. I did want to mention what she has mentioned with respect to ARDS and SARS. ARDS, which is not a term used very frequently, is acute respiratory distress syndrome, and SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, is a sub-classification of that. And of course, the episodes that we had with SARS in 2003 were kind of a wake-up call for us of how rapidly these diseases can spread, and indicates that we should continue to pay attention to the potential of SARS as well as H5N1 in the future. Liz also mentioned the viral medications that are presently effective against H1N1, Tamiflu and Relenza, although their overall effectiveness is somewhat questionable and perhaps can best be ascertained after this is over. Next slide, please. There are a couple of slides that I'm going to be using that were obtained from Workforce Management, which is a web-based company that you can join, and I would recommend that you do so just to get the general information that they prepare from time to time. They did a survey of 158 companies in November of 2005 regarding pandemic training, and some of the findings there was that 57% of the companies surveyed had no plans in place to deal with any kind of a flu epidemic. Next slide, please. Just recently, that is the April of 29, this same group indicated some actions that are being taken to quell the swine flu fears. Key among these are restricting employee travel, updating pandemic preparedness plans, and emails with information provided by public health officials. They found that employees that had established preparedness plans during the avian flu crisis several years ago are seeing their efforts pay off. Heavy equipment maker Caterpillar, based in Peoria, Illinois, is using its avian flu pandemic plan to guide the company's actions at each facility worldwide, partnering with International SOS, which is a company, if you don't know about, you should check into to help you. Also halting travel to Mexico unless it was urgent, and providing medical kits to employees that have to go to Mexico. EMC, a technology company near Boston, says its preparedness plan that details how the company will operate if the outbreak spreads. They haven't initiated travel restrictions, but employees in Mexico are using flexible work locations. S.C. Johnson, based in Racine, Wisconsin, began implementing portions of its pandemic preparedness plan, and the plan is limited travel to Mexico, sending information to employees and ways to stay healthy. So you can see that as of very recently, these are some activities being done by companies. They all have in common limiting contact with employees or with establishments in Mexico and limiting travel there and providing some type of guidance to their workforce. Next slide, please. The workforce also found some information that was interesting with companies that do not have any pandemic plans. The Cleveland Metropolitan School District sent out emails, automated phone message with information to employees after a case was diagnosed in Ohio. The law firm of Brian Cave is posting information on its website, but it has not sent emails to its 2,300 employees for fears of causing a panic. I mentioned it is a law firm after all. Interpublic Group, a marketing and consulting advising advertising firm in New York with 43,000 employees in more than 100 countries, has restricted travel to Mexico and advised employees in affected areas to work from home. And Rooms to Go, a Tampa-based furniture chain working with pharmaceutical benefit manager to get generic forms of the antiviral medication to its employees. Companies also allowing employees who are sick to take time off without having to use sick days. Aon Consulting suggests that employees should establish crisis communication plans, provide a central source responsible for answering questions and collecting site-specific information. Next slide, please. I'm going to now briefly show you the results. Excuse me, there was one other slide that was very important, and this was just sent out via a list server email on May 5. And it's from a corporate medical director, and I think his questions are interesting. He says, I have been asked to review my company's pandemic preparedness guideline and suggest revision. The guideline was developed prior to my time here, and in my opinion is too detailed and probably impossible to comply with on a practical basis. While it's too detailed in some areas, it doesn't offer clear guidance on such bread and butter issues as, should we bar entry to the plant to anyone who has an upper respiratory illness, or whatever the symptoms of the pandemic illness are? Should employees be allowed in the plant if they have a family member or anyone who has an upper respiratory illness? Should questionable cases be handled by in-plant medical or versus referral to a personal health care provider? And should we pass out masks, respirators, et cetera, et cetera? And I sense the extreme practicality of these questions coming on May 5th to a company that's just been to a medical director that's just been handed the guidelines that were prepared prior to his coming and reviewing these from the practical aspect. He ends up saying, I have opinions on these and other related questions, but wanted to ask others on the list if they have any documents they like and are willing to share and or links to a well-written practical guidance on the web for me to refer to as I review our company guidance. This was posted on the 5th. I've seen no responses to this. And as I was pointing out in a minute, there's been little responses to a query that I had to the semiconductor and semi companies from the standpoint of updating where they are with respect to pandemic planning. Could I have the next slide, please? In 2005, the occupational health system that I manage did a survey of corporate preparedness for pandemic influenza. And of course, this was associated primarily based on the SARS epidemic and the potential for H5N1 to grow larger. There were 19 companies that participated in this survey. You can see them listed there, both the device manufacturers and the equipment manufacturers. Next slide, please. The results of the survey of the 19 companies are presented on this slide. You can see that in February 2, 2006, that about 40% had completed a corporate pandemic preparedness plan, and about 20% had begun such a plan. Another 20% said the plan was near completion, and a full 20% had not even initiated the plan as of that date. In January, you click on that next one, I guess it shows up there. In January 1st, 2007, we issued an update of these 19 companies, and we found that in this case, by this year, a year later, that 75% had completed their plan, about 5% had begun, another 5% had not started, and about 15% the plan was near completion. So a real change in attitude and in production and development of corporate planning took place during these 2 years. And if I had one more click, recently asked today what the situation was of these 19 companies plus some others, and I have received about 3 responses to that. So it's impossible to update this survey at this time. Hopefully I'll be able to do that a little bit later. Next slide, please. The next 4 slides are concerned with the survey that was done by Mercer Human Relations Consulting Company in March of 2006. 450 companies in 38 countries in 26 industries. So this indicated a pretty widespread survey. The key indicators that Mercer used to gauge preparedness were the budget for such preparedness, the crisis leadership management, pandemic business continuity plan, workforce planning, and employee communication strategy. Next slide, please, will show the results of the survey involving these 450 companies. And the key indicators here are that 90% of the companies forecast moderate to high impact due to high absenteeism associated with the pandemic, but only 47% of respondents have actually established a business continuity plan. Next slide, please. The same survey indicated that only 17% of companies had established a pandemic budget, and this was down to even 7% in the U.S. and 9% in Canada. And the reason for this is shown in the next slide, in which the conclusions that Mercer made was that there was a considerable gap between the organizational concern about the impact of pandemic and organizations' current state of pandemic preparedness. Those countries that had endured the avian SARS crisis in 2003 generally more advanced. Conversely, in the U.S., not impacted by SARS for the main part, no exposure to avian flu, was in its relative infancy. Labor-intensive industries have recognized the profound consequence that a pandemic may inflict. Although results differ considerably by region and industry type, organizations globally are predicting that a pandemic will result in financial hardship. Next slide, please. This next slide lists a number of suggested preparedness considerations for businesses. I'm not going to read these because you'll have them available on the PowerPoint presentation, but they are good guidelines that if you're involved in monitoring, modifying, establishing your pandemic preparedness plan, you need to take these into consideration. I'll only indicate that number 9 is in the area of communications that I think is very important, and that is to tell the workforce about the threat of pandemic flu and the steps the company is taking to prepare for it. In emergencies, employees demonstrate an increased tendency to listen to their employer, so clear and frequent communications is essential, and I think it's very important. We can look at the next slide. What I have listed here is a site that you can reference the National Pandemic Preparedness Plans for a great number of nations. They're very small to see there, but if you'll go to the website PLOS Medicine, you'll have these available, and you can look at each company's preparedness plan, and in locations where you have operations, this may be very important. Could I have the next slide, please? This slide harks back to the H5N1 scenarios, but I think it's very important in seeing H1N1 experience as a wake-up call for H5N1 scenarios. And when you're working on your pandemic preparedness plan, although it's pandemic with any type of an upper respiratory infection such as influenza, you have to keep H5N1 in mind. A lot's been said about this. It kind of comes and goes, but it's festering out there in the environment and still has a potential to become a very devastating disease, and we just need to keep that in mind, and I have no qualms about saying that. 4 scenarios here I presented. Let's say H5N1 does not go human to human. The poultry industry, of course, would be affected. The rest of the world would go about its business. But another pandemic, flu pandemic, was still likely to occur in the next 2 decades. A mild pandemic scenario, small increases in infectious disease rates. Medical systems cope with increases in patients. This is where we are with H1N1. Moderate pandemic, 4 to 7 million extra deaths. Law and order generally maintained. World financial system holds. 20% small, medium business go bankrupt. Medical systems unable to cope at peak times. But the world returns to business as usual within 2 years. That's not a very good-looking scenario, but it's one that you have to keep in mind in planning. And of course, you've got to also consider the extreme pandemic, which we had in the 1917 area of pandemic flu, influenza, 100 million to 1 billion extra deaths, civil, financial, medical systems fail for extended time, long-term changes in world order, and long-term turndown in world economic performance. A lot of people will say this latter one just, is too unlikely, but I would advise you to at least keep these things in mind because they have happened before. The key individual who has been given corporate responsibility for pandemic preparedness must seriously consider how he or she will respond to corporate management concerning corporate actions based on a variety of scenarios. This individual's responses can range from make no waves, this thing will die out, to if this thing goes ballistic, will my plan and my recommended actions actually pay off? Could we have the next slide, please? Liz has listed a couple of sources for, well, let me go ahead and go with this one before we go to the sources. I had not seen this. These are some important planning considerations I think are very important in conjunction with the ones listed earlier. That is, what are we doing right now with respect to training and travel, financing, corporate responsibility? What company resources in terms of time, money, and personnel should be committed now and in the next 3 to 5 years? How stable will today's utilities be? How will my company respond to company identified benchmark actions or triggers? How stable will the supply of critical parts, materials, and services be? How many employees will actually come to work? How will they be protected? How about their children or other family members at home? What are the critical areas for corporate survival, including corporate hibernation? And what planning sources are available? If your company has given you the responsibility for corporate preparedness, be certain that you also have the authority to make it work. And I might mention in this connection, just always do the right thing. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, Liz had given some information resources. There are many out there, and you all are probably aware of them. I would say these 6 at least, make sure you have these from the Department of Health and Human Services, CDC. The International SOS is being used by many high-tech companies to assist them, and the WHO, OSHA, and the Occupational Health Disaster Expert Network. Next slide, please. Some additional planning guidelines that I would recommend that are available online. First of all, OSHA has prepared the document preparing the workplace for influenza pandemic. CDC has a planning guide, interim pre-pandemic planning guidelines, community strategy for pandemic influenza mitigation in the U.S. Health and Human Services has their Health and Human Services pandemic influenza plan. And finally, the Department of Homeland Security has a document, Pandemic Preparedness, Responses, and Recovery, Guide for Critical Infrastructures and Key Resources. Next slide, please. I wanted to prepare a slide that would just put a perspective on what's going on today. We're concerned with H5N1 and right now H1N1 influenza, but there are pandemics that have been going on for some time in the world. And just to make you aware of these, I know you are basically aware of this, tuberculosis has almost 14 million prevalent cases at this moment, with 9.3 million new cases in 2007 and 1.3 million deaths. HIV/AIDS right now has 33 million cases throughout the world, 2.7 million cases diagnosed in 2007, and 2 million deaths during 2007. And malaria, which is a disease that I'm working as a volunteer in for some time, 2 billion prevalent cases at this time, 350 to 500 million new cases in 2007, and 1.5 million deaths. In the footnote, I indicate that 3,000 children under the age of 5 die each day from malaria, 90% in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's a website there if you want more information you can look to. And that concludes my presentation. The final slide presents my contact information. Any of you have questions about the presentation or areas that I can assist with, do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Don, thank you very much for that enumeration and introduction to pandemic preparedness and planning. Can you sit there, just hold on, because we're going to need you for the question and answer session. Next on the agenda is Mr. Aaron Zutti, who will be presenting a 15-minute talk about pandemic planning, rational approaches. Before we get to Aaron, I just wanted to remind everyone that you can ask questions to our speakers using the webcast interface. You can click on the double arrows in the green box. That will open up the control panel for the webcast. In the questions section, the second box, please type in your question. Hit the send or submit button, and that will be forwarded to our presenters. Aaron, are you with us today?
I'm here, Sanjay.
Okay, let me just bring up your speaker bio. Just one moment, please. Here it is. Aaron Zutti is the Senior Director of the Environmental Health and Safety Division at SEMI. His role is to coordinate global EHS activities in support of SEMI member companies. Zutti has over 30 years of experience, including 20 years in the semiconductor and high technology industries. Before joining SEMI in 2008, he worked in various EHS facilities and security positions at Asus Technologies, Cirrus Logic, National Semiconductor Company, Varian Associates, and as an independent consultant. Zutti holds a Master's of Science degree in Occupational Safety and Health from the University of Southern California, USC, and a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Technology from California State University in Los Angeles. Aaron, thanks for joining us. Let me bring up your slide.
Thank you, Sanjay. Good morning to those in the U.S. that are joining us, and good evening to those in Europe that are joining us. Before I start my presentation, I would like to go ahead and answer a couple of the questions that have come in so far, because I think everybody is probably interested in these. We will, in fact, post all of the presentations on the SEMI website, the same website that you went to register for this webinar. In addition, we'll be posting, and I'll be getting into this in a little bit, but we'll be posting resources that we receive, hopefully from you, going forward, and we'll be posting links to many of the resources that are available on the internet. Prior to joining SEMI, I was a member on and I ran emergency and contingency response organizations. So I know how overwhelming situations such as the current virus situation can be. In fact, SEMI itself is a global organization with operations in the U.S., Europe, and Asia. And we currently, in a couple of weeks, have an upcoming trade show in Singapore that we're trying to manage visitor questions and concerns over. So believe me, audience, when I tell you that I feel your pain. What I would like to do with this presentation over the next 15 minutes or so is to provide some suggestions for organizing your thoughts and your approach for responding to the current situation and for planning for the next one, which I believe is inevitable. So next slide, Solange. So this is where we're at. And these are the type of images that your employees, your management team, and your community are seeing. Next slide, please. Now remember that in many instances, perception is reality. And for a large number of people, what they see on TV, on the televised news, for them is reality. And messages such as this, attention, we interrupt this emergency breaking news bulletin with an even scarier emergency breaking news bulletin, is what many of these folks are seeing. Next slide, Solange. So here's what I want to talk about. In any crisis situation, crisis planning situation, I believe that there's a number of things that planners and implementers of crisis plans need to do. And the first thing is to try to take a minute and get yourself out of the heat of the crisis. I like to borrow from the incident command structure a bit, in that if you have the opportunity to have an advisor to you that is not part of your planning team, is not part of your crisis plan executor, is detached from the process, but an advisor that can sort of sit off to your shoulder and let you know if you're about to do something stupid, that is actually most helpful. So take a minute to get out of crisis and organize your planning and response efforts. And as the cartoon shows, categories such as things I won't do now, things I won't do later, and things that I'll never do, while may not be the most effective, at least she's got a plan. Next slide. So here's my suggestion. There's no lack of information on the internet, and in fact, the amount of information can be overwhelming. Because in fact, a lot of the information does not provide the practical advice and the information and the benchmarking from peers that you really need at this time. In fact, we has created a website, and we'll be posting resources there. And what I would like to encourage folks is to send information that they can share. Company policies, company plans, if possible, would be most helpful for other people to be able to see, because benchmarking on these things is incredibly important. If you need to remove your company name from the materials, obviously I understand that, and that's great. If you would like to send it into SEMI and have us aggregate the company plans and responses, we can certainly do that also. But I think the key is to be able to share practical, industry-specific information. And I'll be talking about this a little bit more at the end, where you can send the information. So what I suggest is that you can't do everything at once. You need to break your tasks down, your planning and your execution tasks down into prevention and response activity buckets. And these are the buckets I chose. I don't know if they're the best. I know there's some overlap between them. But what I'd like to talk about in the rest of the presentation are things that need to get accomplished that deal directly with people, things that need to get accomplished that have to do with the work area or the work environment, things that your facilities organization can help you with, things that human resources can help you with, general sort of business continuity issues, and some of the legal issues involved. Now, I'm not going to cover any of these in detail, but what I would rather like to do is establish a framework for you to be able to identify some of the major activities in these buckets to help you identify potential gaps in your program that you need to go out and fill. Now, I will also make a note that there's actually buckets within these buckets, and depending upon how your organization stratifies the emergency or the activity or the situation, you're going to have certain activities that will kick in at certain phases. Early phases, maybe notification. Later phases, maybe active monitoring and denial of access to facilities as the situation ramps up. Next slide. Okay, so let's walk through these. The first one I call people activities. In any crisis situation, communication is the key. Regular, honest, transparent communication. Because I think, obviously in the U.S. and I think in most nations, employees have sort of three fundamental rights. They have the right to know what's going on. They have the right to participate in the activities if they choose to. And they have a right to refuse to do things if they believe that risk. And so communication among your employees is key to have an effective response. You hear a lot about distancing strategies. And what exactly are distancing strategies? Well, I mean, from my understanding, and I'm not an epidemiologist and I'm not an industrial hygienist, but my understanding is that in these sort of pandemic situations, the best things to do are just to simply keep people apart. So if you can, in your plans, provide information and strategies for people to avoid face-to-face contact and to avoid other people in confined spaces. They recommend a distance, a personal space distance of 3 feet. Such things and suggestions as using conference call and video conference as opposed to having face-to-face meetings, working from home and having HR and work policies that facilitate. Recommendations to have your lunch, bring your lunch to work and eat at your desk rather than in a common lunchroom. Avoid public transportation, perhaps take the stairs, not enclosed elevators, and things like ghost shifts. Ghost shifts are in a multi-shift facility is having, for example, the first shift leave the premises 10 or 15 minutes before the next shift shows up so that you don't have the face-to-face transfer. Obviously, there are important critical operations where information has to be exchanged. But as much as possible, get people out of the facility, let the facility ventilate before you bring the next shift in. And then obviously the basic education on personal health and hygiene, washing your hands, coughing into a tissue, those sorts of things, and use of PPE. Work area activities. Like I said, these are things related to protecting the facility, protecting the work area itself. A lot of companies have begun or were doing facility access screening, providing information for employees to self-screen themselves on when to stay home and not to enter the workforce. They do this through door postings. There are flow charts and checklists that can sort of help with this screening process, and I'll show an example of one of those. Some places have begun, in some countries have begun active temperature screening. And one good way actually to restrict work activities is to just control the number of visitors and the number of deliveries if possible. to the facility. Contact management is a concept, and by contact, we're talking about people who have had close physical, less than that 1 meter face-to-face space, close physical contact, or were within a confined airspace contact with any infected person within 4 days of that person developing symptoms. Contact management means an approach to identify those that have been in contact, isolate, and monitor those folks. In other words, identify who these people might be and keep them from coming into the facility. There are also issues in dealing with people sick at work. What do you do when someone feels sick at work? Do you have a process, again, for screening to see if that person might be a potential candidate for the virus? Provide them PPE, isolate them, and send them home, and then disinfect their work area. Okay, Sanjay? This is an example, some of the resources that we're going to post on the website, or we may have already. 3 resources that I've pulled from for a lot of the information on developing these buckets, and most of the information on the buckets are in those. This one is from an influenza pandemic planning guide. It's a business continuity planning guide from New Zealand, actually, and it's got some very useful stuff in there. And it talks about how do you screen, how do you tell if an employee has got a common cold or the sort of normal flu, or if it's indeed with the influenza virus. Most companies in their screening processes have a 1+ sort of approach, where someone with a fever over 104, with a fever plus a headache, with a fever plus aches and pains, with a fever plus nausea is a likely candidate for infection. Next slide, please. Companies have done things such as self-screening notifications, emails, or postings on the door, basically alerting people that if you have been in contact with someone with the virus, or if you are exhibiting certain symptoms, it's recommended not to enter the workplace. Next slide. And this is an example of a screening flow chart. This one, again, is out of the Business Contingency Continuity Planning Guide from New Zealand. And again, it walks through a thought process for companies to use in screening personnel when deciding when to keep people home, as opposed to letting them come into the workplace. Next slide, Sanjay. So there are certain things that your facilities organization, as part of your plan and as part of your active response activities, can do to help you out. The first is sanitizing. Obviously, common areas with hard surfaces that can be sanitized on a regular basis. Conference room, lunch rooms, break rooms, restrooms, etc. Air circulation and prevention is one of the key elements. If it's possible within your facility to increase the percentage of fresh air makeup to flush the facility, or if you can simply increase the mechanical airflow in your facilities, increase natural ventilation if possible, and increase the preventive maintenance on HVAC systems. And like I said, the key here is just to provide as much air volume dilution as possible in the workplace. Custodians are typically a key workforce in these sorts of things, but they do need you need to make sure that they do have some basic training and information on what the influenza virus is, how it can be transmitted, what their role is in cleaning and sanitizing the workplace. And they also need to be trained on when it's appropriate to use PPE, what to do with tissues and PPE that employees perhaps have disposed, and how that's handled. And then your facilities organization, obviously, these are the guys that are going to stock your hand sanitizers and refill your hand sanitizers, provide tissues in the workplace, PPE, etc. Okay, Sanjay. Human resource activities. I've had a number of long discussions with our human resources folks here. I'm not a human resource professional, but I'll tell you lately I've read a whole bunch of stuff having to do with human resource issues, because I think this is some of the key sticking points in many of our contingency planning is one is pay policies. What are your pay policies and what are your HR rules in terms of sick leave, workers' compensation, disability, private medical, use of private medical, extension of time off under these sort of conditions. Okay, what are the policies and when do these kick in? When an employee has to stay home, and what rules apply when the employee stays home for their own illness or they've been for their own exposure contact issue? What are the rules that kick in when the employee is home because they have a child or dependent that's home sick? What rules kick in when the employee stays home because they're afraid to come to work for whatever reason? What policies kick in when the employee is out volunteering in the community to assist in local community organizations? And then what do you do if your company decides to have a stand down for selected staff? I don't think any companies have implemented, but I know companies have talked about having a facility stand down for the non-essential, non-critical personnel. And again, the idea is to keep people from acting in groups. Employee privacy, leave, discrimination, disability rights, these all become an issue when you start talking about health screening. We start talking about either passive door, such as emails and door screening, or active, such as temperature screening programs. What privacy discrimination issues kick in when you start denying access to the facility from employees? And what if you have an employee that is sick and must stay at home, but it still feels like working and would like to telecommute? Do you have policies to be able to support that? And then finally, what sort of human resources response do you have for situations where the employee refuses to work? Next slide. My business continuity bucket, these are pretty sort of standard stuff, but in terms of business continuity activities, as in an organization, you need to be able to maintain your essential services. And everybody is going to have to identify for themselves and in their organization who are their essential staffs. What are the critical skills, which may include special licensing or certification of folks. Identify any sole source or perhaps single points of failure in the supply chain or among employees. If you've got a key employee that's the only one that knows the access code to a database, for example, the idea is to provide some backup and cross-training so that if someone is out sick for an extended time, as I said, they may be up to 40, 50% of the staff may be gone for up to 2 weeks. How do you have backup for those single points? Protect your data. Ensure your supply chain. A lot of talk about supply chain. What do you do when you have a single source supplier on a just-in-time inventory basis and half of their drivers are off sick and you're not getting deliveries? Can you second source that? Can you pre-stock? Those sorts of things. And then, what happens when the border closes? If you've got a sole source from a country and they've closed their borders or you've closed yours, how as an organization can you manage that? As Don said, companies are using third-party medical advisors to help them make decisions in these sort of tough times. A lot of companies actually have insurance coverage for contagious diseases or can get insurance coverage for contagious diseases as a business interruption policy. Business continuity, if you restrict travel, how do you get your work done? If you close the workplace, how do you get your work done? And for SEMI, what happens if we have to close an event, such as one of our shows? And then finally, like I said, you need to plan, in worst case, for staff absences, 40 to 50% of your staff for up to 2 weeks. Next slide. Finally, there's a number of legal issues that we need to talk about. We need a legal bucket. We need to talk about what happens or what are the possible implications if you do not act and virus is indeed present in your facility. Do you run into the situation where employees refuse to work because they perceive that you're ignoring the risk? On the other hand, what happens if you act too soon and too vigorously and yet the virus is not present, or in this case is maybe not as strong as people first thought? Do you create undue concern, resulting in possible accusations having to do with privacy rights, leave, discrimination? Can you screen and deny people access to the facility when the virus is perhaps not that virulent? These are some questions folks are asking. Legal can help make sure your responses are consistent with the CDC and the WHO guidelines as the standard or sort of duty of care. What are the legal implications of antiviral medications and requirement of vaccines if one becomes available? What is your duty of care as an organization to your employees? And if you've got unionized or organized labor, what sort of bargaining issues might you run into? Does the current situation and your changes in workforce policies create problems in labor terms and conditions? Now, I talked about information sharing at the beginning. This is the result of a EHS Grapevine question initiated by Jeff Clark, who is the head of the the TURF organization, which is part of CESHA, the Emergency Risk Planning folks. He summarized the responses that he got back on these questions he asked, simply asking which companies are doing door screening, which companies are stockpiling PPE, altering absence policies, and are using outside resources. Like I said, I think this sort of information is really most helpful to you folks. Next slide, Sandra. So what I want to ask is that SEMI is going to build a database, a website for resources, and yeah, we'll post what we think are useful and key links to organizations, links to resources, and we'll post PDFs of documents that we come across that seem to be particularly useful. But what we would really like to post would be specific company responses, specific company policies, plans, activities, and actions we can, like I said, either remove your name as a company or aggregate and share the data from, so that we can learn from each other. I don't have all the information. None of you all have all the information, but I think together, if we share the information going forward, it will be most effective for everybody. All right, Sanjay, that's it.
Thank you, Aaron. Aaron, would you also like to mention our collaborative work with CESHA and TURF, and in particular the upcoming CESHA Symposium and the Emergency Preparedness Roundtable?
Yeah, in fact, I did want to acknowledge our partners in this webinar, which is CESHA. They're at their annual conference this year in Phoenix. They're in fact going to have, they're going to organize a special roundtable on pandemic and preparedness planning. You can go to their website. Information, if you're not already familiar with it. Their conference is the week of May 18th. Their website is www.semiconductorsafety.org. One of the other things I forgot to mention is that we have received a number of comments and input that it would be useful for SEMI to look at developing a business continuity guideline, sort of along the lines of the SEMI standards or the safety guidelines like the S2 document, but specifically related to business continuity planning and recommendations and guidelines for the high-tech industry. So we're looking at putting that together. I've got a number of people that have volunteered to serve on any committee that would look to put together a SEMI guideline on business continuity planning. So if you're interested, my email's on the screen. If you have resources you can send me for posting on our resource site, that's the email. If you were interested in participating in the Business Continuity Guideline Committee, please let me know that also. Thanks for the reminder, Sanjay.
Thank you, Aaron, for providing some rationality in these hysterical times. Right, because we're going to need you for the question and answer session. Next on the agenda, we have industry perspectives on emergency planning and pandemic planning. And joining us today is Raylene Wong. Raylene, are you with us today?
Yes, I am.
Okay, let me just bring up your bio, just a minute. Here it is. Raylene Wong is a Senior Manager of Business Continuity for Applied Materials. She is responsible for disaster response and recovery systems and plans for Applied Materials locations worldwide. She is also the Global Pandemic Manager. Prior to moving to Applied Materials, she was the Disaster Recovery Manager at Selectron Corporation and Emergency Preparedness Coordinator for the City of Sunnyvale. Raylene is past chair of the SunGuard International Users Group and is a Certified Emergency Manager through IAEM, the International Association of Emergency Managers, and a Master Business Continuity Planner through the Disaster Recovery Institute International. Raylene, we were happy to see that you're joining us today, and I guess you're going to let us know about not only Applied Materials Emergency Response Preparedness Plan, but also plans from other groups. Raylene, please feel free to take over.
Thanks, Sanjay. Actually, I had planned to primarily talk about what Applied Materials is doing, but in the same regard, we did do a good deal of benchmarking throughout the process, just check bases to see where people were within their planning. What I wanted to start with was some background information on our program to kind of give everyone an idea of where we were when the situation began escalating last week, because I do think it's relevant. Applied's pandemic planning efforts began in 2006 with leadership from Global Business Continuity, Corporate Environmental Health and Safety, and Global Security. And what we did is we actually created a task force to work through a lot of the issues Aaron's slide showed in all of those different subject matter areas. We developed our corporate plans that were ultimately rolled out globally. And one of the challenges that we had very early on, and I think one of the other presenters had already talked about it, but there's just so much information. And so we kind of got overwhelmed at one point. It's, where do we start? So what we ended up doing is we did work with International SOS in the development of our plans. We had some good templates, at least a starting place, that we made them work for Applied Materials. The plans themselves were based on the WHO phases, and they included triggers for implementation. So within those phases, what we did is we developed action tables for each of those functional groups that would need to be involved in a response, and then created about 130 information sheets that provided instructions or were posters that could be displayed in common areas, very similar to the entry screening slide that Aaron showed as well. So all of this had been done well before we came to last week's event. We also had them translated into 9 different languages so that our messages would be consistent throughout Applied Materials. If we had individuals in our Japan office and instructions on how to really wash your hands, we wanted to make sure that it was correct in Japanese as well as in English. The high-level decisions regarding our overall planning methodology were really, we wanted to make sure that it was recognized at our executive level. So we presented the planning strategies to a pandemic steering committee. They gave approval and gave the commitment that Applied Materials would spend money, time in planning for a pandemic. We created a pandemic website that we had information available for the general employee population. So it was just general information. The original website actually was geared towards the avian influenza. But we did have a lot of information. We also had a secure area for our business continuity coordinators so that they would go in just to see information specific to the action tables and some of the other information sheets. Now, our business continuity coordinators also were the pandemic managers. As I said, these individuals are not dedicated to do BCP or pandemic planning. They're designated. So they do other things, 90% of their time. And so it's a huge volunteer army that we actually have out there. As far as supplies, equipment, and tools, we initially purchased 20 infrared scanners for use at our higher density location. so where we had high volumes of people going through buildings. We purchased and moved over 6 million masks to regional warehouses, 5 of them, throughout the world. We stockpiled N95 masks, gowns, gloves, thermometers for entry screening. We installed waterless hand sanitizer wall units in buildings, increased our remote work capabilities, and worked with our automated notification system vendor to develop a way for employees to check in by phone or internet. And that was a valuable piece that we added. And then we also created, with International SOS, a web-based training class that was required for all employees to take. It was required by Human Resources. And it was just a general overview of avian influenza and then personal hygiene behaviors. So after we did the initial planning, we rolled the plan out to our global sites. And throughout 2007, we actually conducted pandemic preparedness exercises with all of our organizations to identify any issues that we had relevant to their location or any areas of improvement we needed for our plans. We created a breaking news video that we used for these exercises that had a scenario for the H5N1 virus moving from phase 4 to phase 6. Okay, so that's kind of the background on what we had in place prior to escalation last week. And as everybody knows, we started escalating over the weekend, but we were still in phase 3 on Monday. Our leadership group held a conference call to determine what our next actions would be if we actually moved to phase 4. We started regional briefings with our BCP coordinators to provide corporate direction, and then requested that they review their plans for phases 4 through 6. Then, because of the rapid escalation from 3 to 5 in such a short period of time, we ended up holding over 9 briefing regions, Asia, Europe, and domestic, over the course of the week. We updated our website at least daily, in some cases twice a day, to ensure that we had accurate information available. We added a link from our internal website, the homepage for most of our employees, so that it had a link directly to our pandemic page. We had executive teams sending out multiple employee messages, which we felt was very helpful because they were actually sending, a lot of emails asking questions. The pandemic management team met throughout the week to provide guidance, and this information was then relayed to all of our global organizations. As I mentioned, our plans were based on the WHO phases, which was fine, but the assumptions that we used when we developed the plan for the H5N1 was looking at a potential serious pandemic. So what we did is we actually worked with the management team and decided to implement what we called modified phase 5 activities. Some of these activities included defining detailed entry screening procedures. We had high-level plans, but we really didn't have, to the level of detail that we needed to. As an example, in Santa Clara and Austin, we have multiple campuses, multiple buildings on a campus. If we required entry screening for individual buildings, an employee who went from building to building or campus to campus have to go through entry screening multiple times. And we thought, if somebody may have 8 meetings in a day in 8 different buildings, they'd spend half their day or more than half their day going through entry screening. So what we decided to do is make some changes, and we decided that individuals would go through entry screening only one time, and the way we would know that they had passed would be that they get a colored wristband for the day. So on Monday we would use blue, on Tuesday we would use green, on Wednesday we'd use red. And so as long as they had the colored wristband for the day, then they had gone through the entry screening once. That was just an example of that. We had done a great deal of work with our HR policies, identify, sick leave, return to work, those kinds of things. So we pulled those back out and just did a quick review of those to make sure they were still relevant. We checked all of our supply stocks. We began distributing masks from the regional warehouses to our individual sites. We reviewed travel restrictions and made recommendations based on those. We had business units reviewing their training travel events that they had scheduled for or out for 90 days. We worked with supply chain to ensure that our supply chain folks understood what the situation was with those organizations. Restocked our travel kits, and let's see, what else did we do? Oh, we used our automated notification system extensively, actually, to communicate information to our global teams. Now, we actually have two features of our notification system. One is what we call an outbound feature, where we create messages either by phone or by web and push them out to selected teams. So we have a corporate requirement that each of our BCP teams conduct a quarterly test just to make sure that they're familiar with the system, how it works, but also that their contact lists are accurate. The second thing we have, the second feature is what we call an inbound feature. When we did our exercises in 2007, what we found is that we had a very difficult time on how we would track employees' work availability, anticipating anywhere between 30, 40, or 50% reduction in workforce. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to have a way that they could do that either by phone or by web. And so we worked with our notification system vendor so that we would have that capability. We didn't use it in this event, but we can. We can have everybody log on to a website or call a toll-free number, internationally even, and say, yes, I'm able to work today, no, I'm not able to work today, and at least have a starting place on communication with individual employees. At this point, we haven't increased activities in Europe or domestically. However, some of our Asia sites have implemented entry screening, and it's based on government or customer requirements. And that was one of the modifications that we made for Phase 5 implementation, was that we were not going to dictate whether or not all organizations did comply with entry screening and mass distribution. We wanted them to make sure that they monitored local public health authorities' recommendations, or if it was becoming the norm within their region or with their customer base. And Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan were real good examples of that. Right now, we are continuing to monitor the situation and be conducting some postmortems to really determine what worked well and what needs to be changed. As far as lessons learned at this point, I think that for us and for many organizations, having a plan in place was well worth it. Instead of having to create everything on the fly, going from Phase 3 to Phase 5 in 3 days, it was a challenge enough to tweak things as we went along with what we had in place. So for us, that was a major advantage. What we need to do is we need to have more depth on our pandemic management team. We need at least 2 alternates for each primary member to ensure that when we do have our daily meetings, that we have representation from all the core functional groups. We need to have blanket purchase orders for some of our key supply replacements. The quicker we can get things ordered, then the quicker we can receive them. Any delays in that really can cause major problems. We also need to find an easier way to pull out information on where our head counts are seated. And that means regular full-time employees, temps, and contractors. That headcount is really what we use to base all of our distribution of supplies on. So things change so quickly. We may have 500 people in our Germany office this week, and it may be 700, in 3 months. So those change rapidly. So we've got to figure out an easier way to work on obtaining those headcounts by region. We need to figure out a way, and this is partially my fault, that we can separate email. And what I mean by that is we were getting at least 10 to 15 emails an hour just with status information. And so my recommendation is that we may have to get off some lists because everyone was trying to forward information. So we may have to select 1 or 2 reliable information sources instead of trying to deal with so many of them. Some of the things that we also found is that we'll probably need to purchase more infrared scanners. When we were looking at, just in Santa Clara, we have 4 infrared scanners for 20 buildings. We were going to use the infrareds for the high-density populations and manual screening for the others. But then we realized that we may not have the resources available to do the entry screening. So we're looking at potentially purchasing more infrared scanners for that. A lot of the people really stepped up to help on this effort. We had people offering assistance, and those that we did have to ask for assistance were great. So, until we actually do a complete deactivation of our plan, I think that, these were probably the major things that we've learned so far. Okay, that's all I have at this point.
Thank you very much, Raylene. We appreciate all of your advice. And just hold on tight because we do have the question and answer session coming up right now. So just wanted to remind everyone for the question and answer session, for those of you who don't know, you can submit questions using the Webcast interface, and it's very simple to do that. You'll notice on your screen there is a green button, and if you go to these double arrows, which I'm indicating here, this will open up the Webcast control panel. You type in your question here, hit the send button, and that should forward your questions to us. We now have on the agenda about 25 minutes left for question and answers. And just trying to allocate the questions. Anne, are you online? And if yes, have you been receiving questions? If not, let me start off with the question and answer session. This is to all the presenters, and let me just make sure we're all online. Liz, are you with us?
I'm here.
Don?
Yes.
Aaron?
Yes.
And Raylene?
Yes.
In your opinion, is this current pandemic mass hysteria, or are there significant actual risks to corporate continuity and, more importantly, to industry continuity?
May I start?
Yes, feel free.
This is Liz. I feel that based on the information available initially, that every action to date has been significantly important and indicated. Where this influenza goes in terms of transmissibility and mortality has yet to be determined. The risk, of course, is that the individuals in the companies or communities, if this does turn out to be something that's not very transmissible and not very high mortality rate, the risk is, of course, that the employees and that the citizens will think the effort has been wasted, when in reality the indicator actions initially were very, very significant in terms of defining what needed to be done.
Thank you. Others on the panel?
Well, this is Don. I just think that the need to always be aware of the shifts that this thing can take. You've got human, avian, and swine nuclear particles as a part of this H1N1 virus, and to compare that with the H5N1 and the possibility of relocation and retransmission, variations in this thing, to have that type of thing be integrated into an H1N1 would be somewhat catastrophic. I haven't seen any materials that would indicate that this is a possibility because you're going from an H5 to an H1, but that possibility of having an H5N1 strain be empowered by human-to-human transmission via H1N1 is something that I have yet to see, but is lurking back there.
Others on the panel?
No, I agree with both both Dawn and Liz.
Okay. We now have some questions being forwarded to us. Let me go ahead and bring up the first set of questions. What is the recommended sanitizer for viral pathogens? Is there a hand sanitizer effective against viral infections?
This is Liz. I'll take a stab at that. And I would say that as the World Health and CDC scientists are evaluating the virulence of this particular strain, I would be guided by the information that they're putting out. But at this point, they're recommending a basic commercially available hand sanitizer that uses, I believe the number is at least 63%. I'd have to double check that, but at least 63% alcohol, if used correctly, should be effective in greatly reducing the microbial concentration on the individual's hands. But again, the caveat being continue to check the WHO and the CDC sites for if they change those recommendations.
Other panel members? If
Good
not,
answer, Liz.
yes, feel free.
No, go ahead.
Okay, if no one else has any suggestions, let's move on to the next question. Regarding an affected employee's work area, how long should the area be quarantined to assure virus is not present, and what cleaning agents are suggested?
Well, this is Liz again, if you'd like me to take a stab at that as well. I don't believe that there are specific guidelines insofar as number of air changes in terms of the particular area, but the specific area should be cleaned with a germicidal cleanser. Some of the ones that are appropriate would be listed on List E, EPA List E, in terms of the ones that are appropriate for protection against bloodborne pathogens. The other point to note is that a simple bleach solution with a dwell time of 2 minutes is appropriate for cleaning hard surfaces. If this is an area with extensive carpeting, perhaps on the floors and the walls, some additional prudence would probably be indicated. But if it were my company, what I would be doing is making sure that the hard surfaces were appropriately cleaned, whether it was bleach solution with a 2-minute dwell time or a particularly germicidal cleanser that contains a quaternary ammonium compound that would be appropriate for cleaning the hard surface when used according to the manufacturer's directions. And the local public health department in any given area, whether it's in the United States or in another country, there will be a local public health department that if they have any specific indication that in that particular area they have different recommendations, then it would be a good question to suggest to them. But basically, some number of air changes as well as effective cleaning of hard surfaces. And in terms of air changes, I personally would feel comfortable, and this is a hypothesis, this is not written anywhere, but I personally would feel comfortable in about a half a day, because that's the reasonable amount you could be expected to have the sanitation people come in and do the hard surfaces.
Yeah, Liz, this is Aaron. I understand that the virus can live on hard surfaces for up to 2 to 8 hours. Does that sound about right?
It does, for what I've heard so far. Again, remembering that scientists and the researchers are busy answering or evaluating these questions. So what seems to be indicated at this point is that effective cleansing with a germicidal, either the bleach solution, 2-minute dwell time, or the germicide according to the manufacturer's directions, can be truly very effective in dropping down that concentration. Right.
Well, I'm just thinking, like, for instance, if it's someone were to come down sick in an office, obviously get them home and then wipe down and simply close the door until the next day.
Exactly. And,
Okay.
you know, in terms of having an exact number of hours or number of air changes, I don't believe there's been anything recommended in that context, but common sense prevailing in terms of there has been some air movement in that space. The surfaces have been cleaned according to recommendations with whether either the bleach or the germicide solutions, and it should be available for occupancy then.
Okay, thanks.
You know, I would think, this is Don, that the wafer fabs are probably the perfect environment for preventing this thing. Does anyone know if anyone has given particular attention to this type of a question in a wafer fab?
Don, is Aaron, I don't have any technical data, but I know I've talked to 2 different companies that have wafer fabs, and we had that exact conversation and came up with pretty much that same conclusion that, you know, the number of air changes in a wafer fab would tremendously decrease the opportunity for...
Perhaps the best thing would be to put everybody in the wafer fab.
Yeah.
I would point out, too, that in a wafer fab, presumably individuals are wearing gloves so that if they did contaminate their hands, you know, that, again, would reduce the transmission, as well as wearing masks. And I think a point that many people are confused about is the wearing of masks, that it is not so much to protect the individual who's wearing the mask, but rather to reduce the aero transmission of an individual who is infected. So even if an infected individual were in the wafer fab, you have those 3 sets of minimizers, the large volume of airflow, the mask being worn by the person with the agent on board, and the gloves, minimizing any hand transfers. So as the notes, ideally you'd move your company into the wafer fab.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. Considering the data on tuberculosis, HIV, and malaria, why has there not been a push or need for pandemic planning to address those pandemic issues?
This is Don. I guess that was my slide that issued that. It was more or less a perspective thing. And, of course, that's a good question. Like I mentioned in my slide, I'm a volunteer public health advisor for a company that does, or an NGO that does nothing except donations to purchase mosquito nets and deliver them to Africa personally. We've delivered over 50,000 in the last 4 years. I think it's the overwhelming magnitude of these diseases and the fact they're accepted as being the norm, and quite possibly because they are not seen in the first world order of countries such as the U.S. and in Europe, although there are pockets elsewhere. And we see these diseases throughout the third world countries, particularly sub-Saharan Africa with malaria, where it's just unbelievable that you have, 350 million to 500,000 new cases per year over and over, and it's entirely preventable. My attention was drawn to the fact that, and I had to find this out to document it for myself, that you have 3,000 children under the age of 5 dying every day of malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, and that just blew my mind and got me involved. But it's the involvement of people. You will find that there are a number of organizations in the U.S., NGOs, USAID, the World Health Organization, that have plans, that have money to finance these things, but some things like TB and AIDS are just, really run the rampant of prevention, other than the supplying of some medication on a daily basis. That's hard for many countries to do. The mosquito nets we distribute, can last for 5 years for a family of 5. But the whole idea is simply we don't have it here. We've got other concerns, and that's just about the gist of it.
I would make one modest contribution to that in terms of tuberculosis. I believe that with the increase of that in the 1990s, the United States and European public perhaps became more aware that it was not a dead disease. It was back in the population. And with recommendations from technical individuals, I think that there have been some improvements in terms of identifying individuals who are ill and the need for quarantine or management of those individuals. With respect to the United States and Canada, I think that was brought home substantially a couple years ago when you had the infected individual who was infected or presumably infected with multi-drug resistant TB who flew from the United States to Europe for his wedding, flew back to Canada, and then came back into the U.S. through a land source, pretty much evading the radar. And I think the public became a lot more aware of the challenges presented by that. But in terms of true mass numbers, Don is absolutely correct that the bulk of the problem is not in the first world countries, although they have to have some idea of prevention for those diseases. But it's very difficult because of the geographic locale and the difficulty of the amount of resources for the, if you think of either the population as a denominator or the square area.
Thank you for that great answer. And it's unfortunate, but I guess it's one of the problems with risk and the perception of risk. Next question. The CDC on May 1st reported its finding that the H1N1 virus lacks a certain protein, perhaps amino acid, that prevents itself from replicating fast and might explain why the spread of infection has not been as fast as initially feared. Can you please comment on this as it relates to the current flu pandemic?
Well, this is Liz. I hope I'm not talking too much, but some of these seem to be within the biological area that I covered. I would say that in addition to the replication speed gene, they're also talking about the potentially missing gene in terms of lethality of this particular influenza. And as you noted, when we talked about the genetic reassortment and being an RNA virus, the individual every 10,000 or so reassortment or combining, that you have another mutation introduced. So I think that the genome scientists who are studying the gene or reporting or studying the influenza virus are reporting findings as they come upon them that seem to be appropriate to understanding this influenza. But I would caution that I think that more time will be needed in the laboratory sciences before we can say with certainty we understand the genome of this particular influenza and could therefore categorize it.
Anyone else like to chime in? If not, let's go on to the next question. There have been questions if OSHA, that's the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Agency, will require fit testing for N95 respirators used as PPE for pandemic situations.
Those things look like like a one-size piece of apparatus to me. You just squeeze the middle thing over the nose and the rest of it fits. I don't know if there are other sizes for that thing or not. I thought there was just a single size.
Yeah, Don, I think the issue that I've seen on the AHS grapevine go back and forth is under sort of emergency conditions where the use of these respirators is voluntary by the employee due to the respiratory protection guidelines in terms of fit testing and training and all those sort of things apply, and there's been some folks sort of conversing on that back and forth.
Actually, this is Raylene. I got an email yesterday about this specifically, and so here was what I received from our environmental health and safety folks. They said that the OSHA pandemic influenza guidance released in February 2007 discusses the use of the N95 respirators. The guidance is pretty clear and strict about what we must do in occupational settings if we hand out these types of respirators, medical surveillance, fit testing, etc. OSHA does not offer any leniency on this issue for occupational settings, particularly because we as an employer are providing these respirators to workers, and we're required to make sure workers are medically fit to wear a respirator without presenting new hazard. So what I would suggest is that people look at that release, the Pandemic Influenza Guidance from 2007.
Okay. Any other last comments? If not,
Yeah, this is Liz. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but I would also notice that ASHA was charged with the task of the workplace as an aggregate. And I would see a distinction that perhaps should have been identified in guidance like that, or perhaps will be in the future, with respect to a workplace that's either a laboratory working with influenza virus or a healthcare facility, because those two situations would have very different occupational risks for transmission, airborne transmission of the H1N1 versus an average or non-healthcare, non-research lab occupancy. So perhaps that is a distinction that we'll see in future iterations for that particular guidance.
thanks again. I guess we can move on to the next question. Does anyone have a good suggestion for handheld temperature scanners? Please advise.
Well, this is Raylene again. We're using the tympanic thermometers or temperature takers, and then just regular for the other ones, using just regular thermometers, digital thermometers. So we have supplies of IR scanners, the tympanics, and the disposables.
Other suggestions? If not, let's move on to the next question. This one is specifically for Raylene Wong.
Okay.
Can you please elaborate on any modification to sick leave policy that Applied Materials has implemented?
That's a great question. When we first went into working with our human resources team to look at our policies, we wanted to start and see what we had in place and if it would be applicable in the event of a pandemic. And what we did find is we actually have very good policies, and so we did not make any adjustments to our sick leave policy. If there was a need in the situation now where we may have to make, some decisions in a future date based on a single case or multiple cases, we left ourselves open to do that, and it would just require the approval from our pandemic executive team. But we did not make any major changes to our sick leave policy.
Thank you. And the next question is also directed toward Raylene.
Did we implement our pandemic plan worldwide or localized? Actually, what happened is we did activate all of our business continuity teams globally starting on Monday of last week. Just more of as an information, requesting all the organizations to review their plans. Some organizations then met with their BCP teams at a level activation. At the time when we did that, the higher hazard areas for us for Applied Materials would be our Austin and Santa Clara offices. And so we were kind of at a heightened level of activity in Santa Clara and Austin versus some of our other organizations. That did shift towards the end of last week. We had escalation, as I mentioned, in Asia. And so they were activated in many cases doing entry screening at some of our offices overseas. Europe is still not as heavily impacted as either Asia or the U.S.
Okay, thank you. And one additional question for you, Raylene. How have the employees reacted or responded to Applied Materials' course of action? Fear, ridicule, something else?
That's an interesting question. We have received a lot of great comments, thank yous for the continued communication that's going out to employees. When they see the website, see what kind of information is there, we're trying to be, again, very accurate with that. Of course, we have had several questions. Some people have overreacted. They hear a bit of news and they think it's gospel. So what we keep trying to reiterate is that we are using reliable sources of information, and we are communicating through our executive team to all of our employees. So we did have a little bit of the fear factor. I don't think it was as extensive as it could have been had it been more of an impact in Santa Clara and Austin regions. But I think overall they were comforted in the fact that they knew that we actually had a plan. And so I think that helped settle things right at the very beginning of the escalations.
Okay. Well, it looks like we have no more questions coming in from past participants. So I'd like to ask our webcast speakers to ask one another questions. And let me get it started. John, I know that in your presentation you had conducted a survey of pandemic preparedness plans from certain SIA and SEMI members. Do you plan on updating that over the next couple of months and reporting that out? And do you have any plans beyond that for reporting who has action plans?
Yeah, I would like to do that. I had sent out several emails when this thing really took off a couple of weeks ago, just to kind of give a heads up to companies, more or less identifying resources, and I haven't sent out any more since then. But the last one more or less asked companies if they would be willing to participate in updating that survey, which was a little involved, or whether they would just agree to tell us where they were with respect to have they developed a complete plan, are they working on one, have they not done anything, that type of a thing, just to give a quick and dirty. And I got a limited response back. Perhaps the wording of the email indicated that I anticipated them answering a longer thing, which nobody had time for because they were all working on their plans. But I'll probably go back out and request a simpler, just an update to see where they are. Some indicated they'd be willing to participate in the longer survey once this thing had kind of gotten over, so to speak. But yeah, I do have plans of updating that survey. Since we had a couple of benchmarks earlier, I think it'd be very useful.
This is Liz. I would like to ask Raylene how easy it was, or what was the result in your plan development in terms of involvement of the individual locations, local public health authorities, since that would clearly be a link in terms of that particular site and the knowledge that the residents would have as far as the action and as, with respect to the actions that the company would have to take based on the local public health.
Yeah, we've worked very closely with them. We actually were on a task force in Santa Clara County, just so that we had an understanding of how they operated, what kinds of information they would be releasing. And again, like we are on numerous information email or distribution lists, and the public health organizations are one for us locally. That was one of the phase 3 activities that we asked all of our coordinators locally to do. I mean, and it's the international sites, is to make sure that they knew how to contact their local public health authorities and their government offices. So actually it was pretty easy. We didn't have a lot of pushback on that. Many of them do have to report things on a regular basis anyway, so it wasn't a major problem with them.
Hey, Sanjay, this is Aaron. I've been looking at the question board. There's actually a number of really good questions that we haven't had time to get to. So can we, from SEMI, commit that we will collect all the questions, send them to the panel, get some feedback, and then post each of the questions, because we just don't have time to get to all of them, post them back on our website?
Absolutely. And it looks like we got a number of questions right at the end. We will do that. We'll have the speakers provide written responses. And all of the questions and responses will be made available online. And that gets me to the next question. Will the presentation materials and the audio-video recordings be made available? And the definitive answer is yes. Please go to the SEMI webpage that announced the webcast. That was the page that you accessed the registration form. And give us a couple of hours. We'll try to get them posted in the next couple of hours. This is both the PowerPoint slides. They'll be converted to Adobe PDF format, as well as the audio-video recordings, which will be made available as Windows media file. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and as such, we need to close up here. I did want to thank our sponsors, of course, SEMI, the PV Group, Sasha, and TURF. And I wanted to remind everyone that Sasha and TURF will be holding a emergency preparedness roundtable at the Sasha Symposium, which is taking place in Phoenix, Arizona in the United States. We will post information about that symposium on the same website that announced this, same web page that announced this webcast. Please go there, and we urge you to join that. I wanted to thank Liz. Liz, thanks again. Don Lassiter, again, thank you. Aaron Moody and Raylene Wong, thanks again for all of your time and effort. And I wanted to remind everyone that we're having another webcast on Monday, May 11th, and that corresponds with Tuesday, May 12th in the Eastern Hemisphere. Feel free to join us, and probably we'll add some additional information during that webcast. If no one has anything further to say, I am Sanjay Baliga. I'm a Senior Manager at SEMI. Thank you, all the speakers. We'd like to thank all the audience members, and we'll be signing off. Take care. Bye-bye.